Thank you very much for that.
I'm just going to turn the lights off so you can
Very nice introduction, which I hope I can live up to, even slightly. And thank you so much for coming tonight. Can you hear me okay? I normally have a very soft voice, but a couple of my family members have become hard of hearing, so I can definitely tune it up if necessary, but if you can hear me, that's fine, that's great. So what I want to talk about tonight is architectural design and construction as spiritual guidance. And let me just give you a little background about who I am and how I want to structure this talk, because as the young lady there said, these are two subjects that don't normally get put together in our lives between spirituality and architecture. So, as Emma introduced, I was married to and worked with architect Nada Khalili and became known for this building with earth in bags, emergency sandbag shelter. And I did this with my own hands, so I learned how to do it as a builder, even though I was a graduate architect. And then after he passed away, I went out and started teaching it with a great enthusiasm, and it was a lot of fun. But I realized that a lot of the things that we experience, those of us who build it, couldn't be articulated and couldn't be communicated in the world outside, because in a way, Nada Khalili and I had built a little, you call this an oasis or a sanctuary in California. And a year after he died, I left and I entered the world that we all know very well. So I decided to do a PhD, and even though Nada's inspiration was from Rumi, a Sufi mystic poet, my own family background, somehow I ended up doing a PhD on Hagia Sophia in Thessaloniki, 8th century Byzantine church, in order to kind of dignify or research or try to find out. The Masons never wrote anything down, but I wanted to infer somehow with this historical research something that would dignify what all of these people who do it feel and know. So this talk, I'm going to divide it between quite a lot of Hagia Sophia in the beginning and quite a lot of hands-on towards the end. So forgive me if you're here for one or the other, but they'll all come into play at some point. So, oops, wrong direction. There we go. So today what most people think of as architecture is this grid of columns and beams, steel or concrete, between which we put solid or glass walls and move them about according to function, functional program. Because Le Corbusier told us the house is a machine for living in, and we've all ended up with the high-rise architecture, international style, all over the world. And this was my view out of my office window in Manchester School of Architecture, which I consider comes from us being seduced by this primitive hut theory, where we think that humans originally created the original buildings out of pliable materials and then later translated them into more solid materials like stone and bricks eventually. And these were the two major proponents of this theory, Abbé Laugier and Viollet-le-Duc, lived in the 17th, 18th century. So this is what we have to deal with in our minds. So it's not much as Professor Nasser was putting it to us, the inner and the outer. We have to change the way we think. There's a gap in logic, so we have to learn to be very logical. And building things is a very logical process, especially when it's load-bearing masonry. Everything that's up there has to come down logically. So there is a gap in logic in suggesting that you go from a primitive hut, or here's the Palatine hut in Rome in the museum, and there's the Pantheon, 1st century AD. And here is a photo of either Syria or Africa with domed buildings and then some with thatch roofs. So it kind of looks right, but actually you're objectifying architecture here. You're just using the look of it. But in reality, you have to ask yourself, firstly, why would primitive man think about lifting such heavy stones when they could build a perfectly nice thing out of branches and trees and thatch? And secondly, masonry building, the shape cannot be separated from the material. The material generates the shape, and the shape is part of the material. So you absolutely cannot claim that the shape of a masonry building is a copy of a primitive hut done in stone. Doesn't make sense. What does make sense is if you go back, way back in history, prehistory actually, this on this side is Göbekli Tepe, which is 10,000 BC, more or less. And this is Stonehenge, around 3,000. And in the middle is a map of the zodiac, of the heavens. So it's thought that people were lifting these stones and making these configurations to map the heavens, to remember the stars and the movement, which is very important. It gives you your sense of who are you in space. And this is also the way they navigated on land and on sea with the stars. That was their map of time, of who we are, and of how to get around. And Gaston Bachelard, the 20th century philosopher of science, wrote, "One is not a philosopher if one does not become more aware at one point or another of the coherence and unity of the mind." So to me, if we're pursuing the coherence and unity of the mind, we have to go back and start to understand this unitary focus, and that lifting the stones, it's a bit like there was a joke that about a company that found things kept getting stolen, and they were a trucking company, or they were a garbage company taking the garbage out in trucks or something. They kept looking in the trucks and they couldn't find anything. And eventually they realized that people were stealing the trucks themselves, not the contents of the trucks. So I suggest that people were actually doing the moving of the stones for a reason. They were putting them in place. It was a process. They weren't aiming for a product. They were experiencing a process. And here's my favorite philosopher, Plotinus. This probably I should mention to you later, so hold the thought on Plotinus. I will read from him in a couple of slides, in fact now. So let's assume that people are excited to move stones for their own sake and putting them around in a circle and actually finding a center, making a center. I mean, what an excitement that is to scribe a circle. And you're in this infinite space. Space itself is bigger than we could possibly conceive of. But once you make a perimeter, you can start to focus. And that is a space that you can imagine, that you can conceive of. So this is a gravestone of a Roman surveyor with his sciotherum, which was the vertical thing that he put on the ground and made a shadow, and then the two axes with which he laid out and surveyed land, basically. The other side is quite a rare illustration of a mason with a rope or a chain, learning the ropes, as they say, making a circle. And here, this is in California, where we were doing earth building. We would put a stake in the middle of the ground and mark the building out on the ground with chalk. So it sets up a philosophical conversation between center and perimeter. Here's where I'll read you a little bit of Plotinus. So Plotinus, in his beautiful Enneads, chapter 2, Ennead 5, chapter 2, he says in beautiful Greek, which I won't read you the Greek, but there we go. The one is all things, the one, meaning the center. The one is all things, and not a single one of them. It is the principle of all things, not all things, but all things that have that other kind of transcendent existence. For in a way they do occur in the one, or rather they are not there yet. But they will be. How then do all things come from the one, which is simple, and has in it no diverse variety or any sort of doubleness? It is because there is nothing in it that all things come from it, in order that being may exist. The one is not being, but the generator of being. So that one is that point in the center, which actually is no point at all. And the circumference is the all things. This was the dialogue set up, which goes on into theology and philosophy and throughout the ages. So we, as builders, we circumscribe a space within infinite space, a place to focus. And it is not dissimilar to the way nature takes the earth and that water keeps dripping and opens a space within earth, within the element of earth, and the water tunnels an arch in the ocean. Or in Cappadocia, people actually carved the mountain. They withdrew the mountain into the caves. And the central is an illustration from Cosmas Indikoplestis, who was a 6th century theologian, traveler, monk, whatever, who mapped the topology of the world, the landscape, as theology, with the mountain in the middle, the heavens, the arc of the heavens, the firmament is the straight line, and then the ocean beneath the earth. The abyss is at the bottom. So when we say earth, we can consider it as perhaps the original matter in which creation, which God used for creation. Although we shouldn't say, okay, this is God and this is matter, because Philo of Alexandria actually put the ancient world right there when he said God created space, hora, and place, topos, simultaneously with bodies, somata. So this earth, it was also, it's a part of, it's that overflowing of the divine essence, but once it then looks back at itself, it becomes the nous, the mind, consciousness. So again, there they are doing the circles and the circumferences. But here we have a figure, very much, I got into this through Richard Temple's book on the mysticism of Christian icons. But that same picture of the zodiac, of the wheel of the 12 constellations, is now overlaid with the geometry of 12. And that center and circle, if you scribe a circle with a radius, and you use that radius then to intersect the circumference, you will divide it into 6. And that 6 can then become 12. And from the 12, you get 4, which we can see in, that is Karahan Tepe in Upper Mesopotamia, just like Göbekli Tepe, Eastern Turkey. All of these are aceramic Neolithic, 8,000 BC or so. And this is Chirokitia, a name which is not explained, but I do have a theory why it's called Chirokitia, in Cyprus, a bit later, about 7,000, 6,000 BC. So this figure, and the middle one is actually Hagia Sophia Thessaloniki, which was a church that was built, a domed church, built within the older Roman and early Christian basilica. So this figure of 4 was called the Earth, actually. I might be able to get the relevant quote. Richard Temple refers to a couple of anthropologists called Saint Iliona and Duchenne. And they look at mythology all over the world and they find commonalities. They say that the 2 equinoxes, vernal and autumnal, are those that cut the year in half with an equal balance of night and day, for they are the 2 intersections of the equator with the ecliptic. These 4 points together made up the 4 pillars or corners of what was called the quadrangular Earth. Since constellations rule the 4 corners of the quadrangular Earth only temporarily, such an Earth can rightly be said to perish and a new Earth to rise from the waters, with 4 new constellations rising at the 4 points of the year. So we can say that these 4 points that are considered the symbol of the stability of the Earth derive again from astronomy and this consciousness that the ancient world had, that their movements, even the maps, Ptolemy's maps were simply, we think that they're primitive sort of maps, but actually they fit with the stars very well. They just don't fit with the Earth very well. So here, this is Hagia Sophia Thessaloniki. This is where the academia is at the moment. They know that there's 100 Byzantine feet square, which they look at over here, and then there's another square in the middle. So they're very focused on the cube. But if you simply put that center, if you simply say this building was created with theology, not with some other kind of more functional geometry, then you're going to start with a center set down with divine intention, usually by the archbishop or the emperor or somebody who's divinely inspired. They set the center, and they made these 6 and then 12. And when I put that on top of the plan of Hagia Sophia Thessaloniki, which, by the way, I've been told it's so accurate and nobody can figure out why is it so accurate in its dimensions, I put it there, I realized this hits every single dome, every apse, every size of these ins and outs of the design. And then you realize, yes, people knew this very well. This piece of pavement is not from Hagia Sophia, it's from Sicily. I can't remember the name of the Monreale, the Cathedral of Monreale, which contains amazing Byzantine figurative mosaics and clearly Arab craftsmen who did all the non-figurative stuff. So the floor is showing us, here we are in the middle, the 6 Cartesian coordinates, just like the Roman Sciotherum, and then the 4, and then 8, and so the Islamic patterns in that case in the Norman church. It was built by the Normans just after they conquered Sicily. So this is how they didn't use drawings in those days, but they had music has a maqam, has a kind of riff, has a system that you learn, and then it sort of unfolds like a raga or something. The musician knows it, they unfold it. So the mason knows it, and he unfolds it. Even the 10th century ekphrasis of Constantine of Rhodes. It talks about the mason, and he says he raised, he stretched out, he unfolded it. He had unfolded it in a circle. So once you start to understand the essential geometry derived from theology and then start to put it together with the act of building, you have something very marvelous as an experience. And, well, early Christian, this is before the church was built, but nevertheless, I think influenced its mosaics. That church of Hagia Sophia, Thessaloniki, being built in the 8th century, was built during iconoclasm, when all the icons, all the figurative imagery was destroyed throughout the Eastern Christian Empire, the Byzantine Empire. And this was hidden. This was done in about they think around the 4th, 5th century, late Roman, basically. So Hagia Sophia, actually, one can also suggest that the masonry architecture itself was carrying the message that we see carried in the icons. It was an example of an unlike representation of Christ. This is a like representation. It has a human there, but we see the same setup. You've got the 4 constellations here. You've got Leo, Virgo, the figure of a human, which is Luke, the evangelist, Scorpio, the eagle, and Taurus, the bull. So you've got the 4 constellations, you've got the circle, the orb, you've got the human figure inside, divine human figure, because that central place is the divine place, on a rainbow, so within this orb of light. And we sense this opening of a space for that which cannot be contained, which in Greek was called chora tou achoritou. But, okay, Hagia Sophia was built during iconoclasm. They didn't have the figure. Now, that central place, if you build a dome, anyone can stand in there. We frequently had people in Hesperia, school groups and students and so on. You'd go in the center of the dome and you'd say your name. And you'd say, oh, wow, it'd all echo back. And this is actually something that I built after Khalili passed away in a ceramic dome in India with a student. She's on her mobile, but she's a good friend. This is just light in the center. And this is an icon of Christ in the center with the waters and the divine ray. So we find here, I'm beginning to sort of move you from the geometry that goes this way to a vertical geometry, because a building goes up and the builder goes up and down. But we can find in the theologians, like Dionysius the Areopagite, who was a bit before Hagia Sophia was built. He was, they think, around late 5th century, 590-ish or something. Or is it early 5th century? Anyway, that he speaks about likeness, about making a likeness, but he also speaks about how something that is not like can equally well lead us to understanding. So I'll read you his quote. "The incongruous elevate our mind more than the similitudes, for there is a likelihood with regard to the more sublime representations of heavenly things that we should be led astray, so as to think that the heavenly beings are certain creatures with the appearance of gold and certain men with the appearance of light." He comes up with this concept, the divine ray, on which this process of creation, let's say, takes place. And in building, we might look at that radius as a divine ray. It is an energy from the center to the perimeter. And so when we deal with the building, let's look at it as an unlike image. It was discussed in iconoclasm. It was even it's even recorded that the building is an image of Christ, or that the liturgy is an image of Christ. So let's look at it as an unlike image of the human who can stand in that central place. So that place that we're looking at was called Hora. And I find it very interesting that we can find two parallel images of Hora, which means space, actually. It means, because the Greek word hora, horevo, choresi, na choresi, it means to be, to accommodate something, to open the space, to contain something. So Plato, the Byzantines also used the concept of hora, but they saw it as the place of God's energies. And I find it really interesting. I found it interesting to analyze the church with respect to this X marks the spot, the divine ray coming down figure. And I found, of course, we all know this he-ro symbol, which is used for Christ, but we tend to forget there's an alpha and an omega either side. So if you just look at the letters, it spells hora, space, a space that's opened in something, like that cave opened in the earth. And you have 12 birds around it. On the other side, we have Islamic calligraphy from, I think, 13th or 14th century. I'm not an expert on this, but a friend tells me it's from a form of Sufism called Hurufism. But definitely, Sufis today are groups who still use the divine names in meditation. Anyway, it seems to suggest that this space is the space in which all the letters, the words, the qualities and properties, in a way I see it as, this is the architect's design palette. It's all the words, is it hot, is it cold, is it dark, and all the poetic words you can think of, and all the qualities of the letters, which after all also refer to different parts of the human being by their sound. This hora in this particular church had the oppositions of masculine, feminine. So you have the men's aisle and the women's aisle. You have the Holy Mother on the east and Christ on the west. You have Christ up in the dome and the omphalos, which is the navel of the earth for the Holy Mother, down at the bottom. So you're setting up this energy system in a space within, which can interact. I'm not going to get deeply into that because that I would like to explore in new work, but it can interact with letters, with words, with properties. And in fact, if we look at, for instance, Dionysius the Areopagite, his Mystagogia, he definitely, I mean, he wrote a treatise on the divine names, on the angelic hierarchies, and his Mystagogia is set up rather like a ladder where, you know, the base is very wide and everything is described with all its qualities and properties, and, you know, it gathers a lot of weight because something very tangible. It's sort of God is this, 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 and then God is not this, 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 and you're going up a pyramid or a dome until God is not, until he says you're beyond words. So these are just some of the ideas that we can look at and think about when we're building a simple earth building, but we don't have to. Actually, we're just working with our hands. We're experiencing something parallel. This is probably the last bit of the church. But the art of translation brings me to how was it set up in this church. You can see you've got that central cube, the earthly cube, and the heavenly dome, and everything in between. So in a way, this sets up a kind of journey for the mason between the realm of the senses, this earthly realm, and then the heavenly self-realized realm, let's say. And it's sort of explained very clearly in the iconography, which the figurative iconography came about a century or so after the church was built. You see they've got Christ in the middle, the Holy Mother, as I said, down below, the 12 apostles, that's our 12 constellations, and then the 4 angels making that figure of 4, and it reflects itself in the structure of the church. But remember, the structure of this church was built first, before that mosaic. So they put cosmology and theology not only in a simultaneous mapping, they also arranged it in a ladder of ascent and descent, which, starting with Jacob's dream, this is from that same Cathedral of Monreale in Sicily, these 2 mosaics. They're both in the same series. So we can also suggest that there was a conscious relationship between these 2. There are the angels ascending and descending in Jacob's dream. And here the masons are going up and down, building the Tower of Babel. And here, this is in St. Paul's Cathedral, in the baldacchino, above the altar. Here we've got a ladder and a chisel and hammer and 2 crossed spades. And here you've got 2 crossed swords, not unlike that Islamic calligraphy, and a D. Well, perhaps we could almost make it into a Chi-Rho, and there another one similar. So, so let's also look at this vertical axis of theology, of creation, the stages of creation coming down, and the mason, of course, building up simultaneously. Let's start to think about the building like that, so we can understand how definitely the Byzantine icons, they map this onto a natural landscape. This is definitely, I learned this from Richard Temple's wonderful work. They map this, God is off canvas up there, because being beyond mind, beyond conception, and really beyond that circumference of creation that we're making. Nevertheless, the overflowing of the divine ray comes down and splits open the earth and makes that cave, that hora, where the birth of the human is happening. And the hora, of course, was a feminine presence. And then down the bottom, that circumfluent ocean, we just have the sound of the water when the baby is being bathed. So this maps the mountain and its different qualities and properties, and the angelic world up at the top in the sort of domed area. I've tried to put it exactly mapped onto the church of Hagia Sophia, Thessaloniki, but the words actually come from an ekphrasis, a poem, a hymn to an Hagia Sophia that doesn't exist. It's thought to have been an Hagia Sophia. It's thought, well, there is evidence that it was constructed in the 6th century during the Emperor Justinian's big building program. And it was, this poem is in Aramaic. It was in the Eastern Empire, in Urha, what was known as Edessa. now known as Urfa in Turkey. And it describes the building. It's one of those rare poems, a eulogy, an ekphrasis, which describes the building from the top to the bottom as this process of creation. O essence which residest in the holy temple. And then it goes on and describes the dome and the divine ray and the different layers, and finally the circumfluent ocean at the bottom. So it's mapping theology, philosophy, natural landscape and the building all onto each other, which now we go to experience, which actually does have parallel in the experience of somebody building from the ground all the way to the top, when they're building with, load-bearing masonry architecture. This is just because the experience that a builder has building those sort of buildings, going up, earth architecture, let's call it now, earth architecture, is the mirror of creation coming down. But in fact, all one has to remember is that there is a potential energy in that whatever stone will be up above. And when you're building from the bottom to the top, you have to be constantly aware, how is that going to come down? And if you don't care and you put everything everywhere else, it's not going to come down. So you actually always are aware of the potential energy, and you're always aware of the center, because that's how the form has to be, otherwise it won't stand up. So you've got this series of the dome summit, the 12 windows, the 4 pendentives, the arched openings, etc., which you've seen before. And here is a simple dome. These are the emergency sandbag shelters and the eco-dome that we built, with a similar kind of architectural hierarchy and formal language: foundations, walls, arches, vaults, dome, going from a wide base all the way up to this voiceless, oneness in the center. And how do we start when we're a builder? Well, there's a lot of digging to do, You think you've studied architecture and you think you've, done a marvelous rendering of a building and it's going to happen just like that. But actually, I found that there's a lot of digging. And that digging is hard work, and you feel grumpy, you hurt at the end of every day, and you just have to keep digging. And you can imagine builders, Hagia Sophia, Thessaloniki had 4 meters deep foundations, and it was a big building. All of these Victorian 19th century buildings we see, they're all built by people lifting heavy stones. And there are masons today who still lift heavy stones. I have a very nice quote, actually, from one Greek mason whom I interviewed. He's Mr. Taurnanas. He said, really, I was a very naughty child when I was small. From 17 years old and beyond, when I started to work with stone, I calmed down. And now I've understood, after many years, it was this which calmed me. There was no other reason. Because you're so devoted to work, to chip, shape the corner, make the dome, your mind must work continuously, and the work takes you there. It forces you to calm down. And as for my life, it has changed me. It's like this. You learn to work with this material, and you have to become one with it. You have to listen to it. You have to be a friend with this material, and you have to listen when it goes tack-tack under the hammer. You have to hear how it's working inside. You don't just do it mechanically like another job in the building trade. You have to be one with the material. They may be stones, but none is the same. You must be beyond work. It must be like your girlfriend. The stone is your friend. You should think about it at night. And in the morning, when you wake up, you must like it. You cannot do this job only mechanically. And to do fine things, you must not do it as you do the other jobs in the building trade. So you're going through all this grumpiness. And you have to learn to like this very heavy, hard work. And you're doing it with lots of people, actually. And one of the big challenges about actually managing a whole group building, this top thing was in Nepal after the earthquake in 2015. I took 4 people there, and then a whole load of villagers and students and everybody, volunteers. We built them a transitional house in 18 days. So everybody's like working through their stuff in the depths, just as we in this sensory world, in this illusory sensory world, are filled with pain and suffering and stress, and life itself is beating it out of us. And this girl, I mean, I like to say that this guy is playing God up there. She's holding up the tamper, but whatever. You're lifting heavy weight, and you are lifting the weight of your heart, because your body, you're having to work, and your mind is having to work, but that you have to start clearing your heart and emptying your mind to allow this to happen more easily, more comfortably. Your body has to attune. And here is someone, you're building the walls. The wall itself actually embodies the unity of opposites. So the stresses of, is it hot, is it cold? That wall is both. So it's also teaching you subjectivity, the importance of looking within, of experiencing, that the subjective message is just as important as the objective message. Objectively, you've got all these qualities and properties of the hot and the cold and so on, but subjectively, you are that wall. You are becoming that wall and that earth. And subjectively, you realize that you're connecting all these things together. And there's a lovely feature which lately has been revised in the last century by a Serbian archaeologist called Slobodan Ćurčić. Used to be called the dog-tooth frieze, but he calls it the radiant frieze. Because at the top of the walls, you get to the top, you can imagine this lightness, this light that begins to dawn as you're actually going above the top of the density of this earthly plane of existence. And we see it in icons too. You've got that radiant frieze, and the Holy Mother and the Annunciation are happening above that dense earthly level. So this is a feature that gets reiterated in levels on churches. But I digress a little from the Masons' experience. I'm just showing you that maybe they were conscious of creating levels and, expressing the experience. So one of the things that then, for a builder, okay, you've done all the foundations, the digging, the schlepping, the heavy work, the walls, and then you start having to put in some doors and windows. So you have to start working with arches, because the arch is the way the earth stands by itself in gravity. And when it stands by itself, you begin to get the message that actually you don't need all that heavy lifting and heavy stress. It's teaching you something. It's teaching you that if you form yourself in harmony, it will stand by itself. The architect Louis Kahn is reputed to have talked to his building materials and asked the bricks, "What do you want to be?" And they replied, "Make us into an arch." And then, so it's said, he tried to sell them a lintel, and they said, "Make us into an arch." So Nada Khalili used to say, an arch is like a prayer. Its strength is in its unity, its beauty in its repetition. So an arch is what the earth does naturally. It's its first principle. But it's teaching you, just like, I don't know if any of you have done yoga, when you're doing yoga, and you have to learn to stand so that you're not actually stressing and tensing and trying to make yourself stand. We're made to stand in repose. So the arch is in repose. It finds it an angle of repose. And these builders decided that they were going to repose on the arch. So we're becoming one with that earth. Human is created from earth. The marble of the Hagia Sophia's was celebrated, actually. The one in Constantinople, all the different parts of the empire, the different communities, they sent marble to build the church. And that stone represented them. And the eulogies write about what you see in that stone. The Sugitha, the Aramaic one, says its marble is like the image not made by human hand, and its walls are harmoniously covered therewith, all polished and white. This marble is so shining that it gathers light within itself like the sun. And Procopius writes about the one in Constantinople, the whole ceiling, meaning the dome, which is obviously very light looking, is overlaid with gold, which adds glory to the beauty. Yet light reflected from the stones prevails, shining out in rivalry with the gold. So even he's saying that this light that's coming from the stone is even more powerful than all those gold mosaics. There is something happening to the builders, and this is embedded in the theology. Human is made from earth. The image not made by human hand, of course, also refers to that imprint on the cloth that Jesus sent to Edessa. So in a way, we're beginning to get the message that returning to earth is also returning to the Creator. We've got this whole pyramid of going up to oneness, but actually, the experience, now I'm going through this experience with you just to show that actually people don't have to think about all this stuff. I did it because I wanted to do a PhD to sort of dignify it. But actually, people who just do it, you experience an analogy for all this. And at some point, if you're doing this, you might pick up a theological text and you just automatically understand it, because you've done it with your body. So finding that angle of repose, you can see these builders here in Nepal, is beginning to inch in, but they're happily now just walking on top of the walls and filling their sandbags. Here we've got an Egyptian mason building a slightly unconventional pendentive. And here, Hagia Sophia with the pendentives, which is the bits that hang down, that actually build up between the arches before they get the base of the dome and then go up. One of the interesting features with this whole idea of this iconic hierarchy is that a dome, it may have a visual center at the top, but it has an intangible center at its heart where, let's say we have pulled that radius, that compass, and we're taking the compass all around to measure how far the bricks need to be from the center. Well, that's the real center, that's the energetic center. When the builder is walking around and making sure everything is placed precisely relative to that center, that's what the builder begins to actually feel, the pull of that center and its effect on his work. So it's not the visual center. It's, well, in the case of this dome, it's that point there. And that's a compass that is measuring, has measured every single brick in this dome. That's me, and that's a real mason. And these motions going around, this is where we get back to the idea that maybe it's just actually doing the work that was why they did it, not for the product, but for the process of it. Those motions, you've got a circle, you've got a straight line, which is the going up, and you've got a spiral, which is the combination of them, which there's a great cognitive scientist called Douglas Hofstadter. I don't know if any of you've read his book called Gödel, Escher, Bach. He coins the phrase a strange loop, because he's talking about how, for instance, Escher has those drawings where he seems to be walking upstairs, but actually they're also walking downstairs. Or Bach has a fugue, and it goes through the riff of notes, and then suddenly you find it comes around to the beginning, but actually he's managed to make it a note or two higher, and he works his way up, and he works his way down. So these are the cognitive principles of analogy, which is the core of cognition. But Dionysius called it the movement of angels. This is the way angels move. And we're just building a dome. We're doing these movements. So going up, everybody is learning not to try to impose themselves on these bricks and on these stones or on the earth in the bags. They're just feeling the center, and you have to stop thinking and just do, and just go with the flow, and you have to be it. You have to, otherwise, as Mason Taranas said, you can't do it. It doesn't work. You can keep checking with the compass, but I've known many people, they just keep checking with the compass, and somehow it always goes wrong. People have to learn to feel it, and really good masons, like these guys. This is me, and we used these brick hangers, which help to hold the brick onto the dome. But these guys, they don't even use that. They're just putting the bricks. This is, forgive me for forgetting your name, James, and his son Lucius, but the last name. He's building. They're reaching that point of just what we call acheiropieton in classical Byzantine, work not made by hands. This is, I think, Carlos Castañeda in Mexico. This technique, you'll find it in buildings as diverse as the Sultaniye in northern Iran, in Santa Maria del Fiore, in Milan. It helps. It just gives you the edge. But these become genuinely work not made by hands. The builder is merely a midwife to this process. The earth itself is generating its forms, and the builder becomes a conduit. Whether they want it or not, whether they're thinking of it or not, it becomes a spiritual process. This is James Anthony, that's it. This is him finishing one of his domes. And this is in Hesperia, one of our graduating architecture students also tamping away. But nothing underneath. You don't need anything underneath. You need to go with that form and with certain techniques. So this, in Byzantine theology, they call it anenergesia, not referring, of course, to building. This is my take on it. But it's doing while not doing, if we refer to building. Anenergesia. Islam also, as a word, has the same feeling of submitting, of going with what the universe wants. And if you work with a team, all that grumpiness and hard edges and quarrelsomeness and so on, you'll find way before this, by about above the top of the doors, that team begins to gel and they start flying, just like a liturgy of Masons when you take communion and you're one heart and one mind. This is what happens to people. They can be very, very different people, very diverse people. But it starts to bring people together. And finally, you have to descend the ladder back down to earth, but with a new realization You may need to do it many, many times, just like, we do a lifetime of going to the liturgy or doing the prayers of 5 times daily prayer, whatever it is, meditation. But we descend the ladder, we come down to the omphalos, that central point from which the divine intention started to unfold everything. And you find that this thing, dome or vault that's been made with the innate energy of earth itself, it rings like a bell because it has that coherence, that coherent logic. There's no break in it. And of course, they're excellent places for music. You can see this person is enjoying being in the center and saying their name. This is drum music, getting it all to reverberate. This young lady is singing in India. So in parallel with, of course, with Hagia Sophia Thessaloniki, I had to compare. I called that church the Rosetta Stone because I could compare iconography, liturgy, and architecture, and they're all happening today at the same time in that building. But it's like the moment of the end of liturgy when there's descent of the Holy Spirit. But you do become aware of the sound of the space, the air in the space, and of course the people. So back to where we are, we still have vestiges of a cosmological landscape, even in London. Sorry, we still have, I'm not sure if this is working actually, we still have vestiges of a cosmological landscape in London, even in terms of that hierarchical system. You see it in all of the traditional buildings, everything that's pre-modern, even late 19th century, 1880s. Manchester's Princess Street is full of such buildings. This is early 19th century, I think, or Georgian, in London. So you still have that landscape, that mountain of the earthly material, the bricks, the stones, the stucco, and this consciousness of these emanations of different levels of creation. Bachelard, in his book, The Poetics of Space, he calls it From Cellar to Garret, and he explores the poetics of the cellar and the first floor, the piano nobile, and the top floor where the, more angelic place. So these can also work for us as a kind of mnemonic going around the city. I'm very close to the end, everybody. This is just a little bit about what I'm interested, where I'm interested in going in the future is, although it's great to build full scale, I think there is a place for building at scale model, because not everything, if you're teaching people, probably the most you can do is one dome or one dome and a couple of vaults. But if you want to also get more into whole designs of architecture, I think I tested this out in Manchester School of Architecture, where I've been teaching this year. And the students at the end, they just said, we felt very peaceful. It felt very meditative. They didn't talk. In all of the rest of the workshop space, they were all chattering away while they worked. But my group, I had 15, 20 students doing these models. They just fell silent. So I know that even at scale model, you can touch on some of these principles. I didn't explain all of this theology to them. I just told them, you're going to learn how to build a couple of domes and vaults. I would like to explore it with larger designs, but also with perhaps some conscious design work with qualities, properties, names. There is a process of, Nada Khalili used to talk about synectics, which is an industrial design process of bringing together seemingly unrelated subjects in order to do group brainstorming using analogy and come up with products. So this possibly, I'm going to test out a small trial workshop in the beginning of July, and we'll see how it goes, but I very much hope that it will be a fruitful direction. That's it. Thank you very much. Back down to earth.